Dead. The Big Red One had already become a legend long before German soldiers began speaking about them with a mixture of frustration and reluctant respect. Officially designated the 1st Infantry Division of the United States Army, it carried a simple red numeral 1 on its shoulder patch, a symbol that would become one of the most recognizable insignias of the Second World War. By the summer of 1944, the men of the division had already fought across North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy. They were no longer inexperienced volunteers. They were battle-hardened veterans who had survived campaigns that destroyed entire divisions. German intelligence officers knew the unit well. Whenever reports indicated that the Big Red One had entered a sector, commanders expected aggressive attacks, relentless pressure, and an enemy that rarely accepted defeat. One German officer later admitted that there were certain American units whose appearance immediately changed the mood inside headquarters. The 1st Infantry Division was one of them. Not because it possessed more tanks or artillery than everyone else, but because its soldiers had developed a reputation for continuing attacks even after suffering casualties that would force other formations to stop. The Germans had learned through painful experience that defeating the Big Red One required more than strong defensive positions. It required breaking the determination of the men themselves, something that proved far more difficult than destroying equipment. The story began years earlier, on June 8, 1917, when the United States officially created its first permanent division for service in the First World War. Veterans of that earlier conflict carried traditions that passed through generations of soldiers. New recruits arriving before the Second World War quickly discovered they belonged to something larger than themselves. They inherited a history built on discipline, endurance, and pride. Officers reminded them constantly that they were expected not merely to wear the famous red patch, but to uphold everything it represented. When America entered the Second World War after Pearl Harbor, the Big Red One was among the first divisions prepared for overseas deployment. Training intensified beyond anything many recruits had imagined. Endless marches under heavy packs became routine. Rifle marksmanship was repeated until loading and firing became instinctive. Engineers practiced constructing bridges under simulated artillery fire. Machine gunners learned to change barrels within seconds. Squad leaders rehearsed attacks until every movement became automatic. Major General Terry Allen, one of the division's most respected commanders, believed soldiers won battles through initiative rather than blind obedience. His officers encouraged junior leaders to think independently. If communications failed, attacks were expected to continue. If commanders became casualties, someone else immediately assumed responsibility. The division developed a culture in which every man understood the mission rather than simply following orders. German intelligence would later discover why this mattered. The Big Red One first entered major combat during Operation Torch in North Africa in November 1942. Allied forces landed across Morocco and Algeria, beginning America's ground campaign against Germany. The environment shocked newly arrived soldiers. Sandstorms blinded entire companies. Water remained scarce. Vehicles constantly broke down. Yet the division adapted quickly. German forces under General Erwin Rommel had already earned a fearsome reputation. The Afrika Korps combined mobility with disciplined leadership, creating one of the most effective fighting forces in the desert. American troops entered combat against experienced veterans who had defeated British armies repeatedly. The early encounters proved costly. Inexperienced American formations struggled against German armor and artillery. Mistakes were frequent. Communications failed. Units became separated across vast desert landscapes. The Big Red One learned rapidly. Officers analyzed every engagement, adjusting tactics almost immediately. Soldiers who survived one battle entered the next wiser than before. German commanders noticed the difference. Unlike many inexperienced formations that repeated mistakes, the Americans adapted with surprising speed. One German battalion commander reportedly observed after several engagements that American infantry seemed to improve faster than any enemy he had previously encountered. Every battle made them stronger. The desert became their classroom. A month later, during the Tunisian campaign, the Big Red One helped force Axis armies toward final defeat in North Africa. German prisoners later admitted they underestimated American infantry during the early stages of the campaign. That mistake would never be repeated. One captured officer reportedly remarked, The Americans learned too quickly. Those words reflected growing concern throughout German headquarters. Following victory in North Africa, the division prepared for another enormous challenge. Sicily. Operation Husky began in July 1943 as Allied forces invaded the island, opening the road toward mainland Italy. German and Italian defenders occupied rugged mountains that favored defensive warfare. Every hill overlooked another. Every valley became a killing ground. The Big Red One advanced under intense resistance. Machine guns hidden among rocky slopes pinned down entire companies. Mortar fire echoed through narrow valleys. Snipers occupied church towers, overlooking villages that had stood for centuries. Progress came one hill at a time, one farmhouse, one stone wall, one ridge. Again and again German defenders discovered that American attacks resumed regardless of casualties. Artillery prepared the way. Infantry followed immediately. If the first assault failed, another arrived. German reports increasingly mentioned the same division. The red numeral appeared again and again inside intelligence summaries. One officer described the Americans as persistent beyond expectation. And another complained that local counterattacks rarely achieved lasting success because the Big Red One reorganized remarkably fast. Sicily eventually fell. The division earned another hard victory. Yet its greatest test still waited beyond the English Channel. By early 1944, thousands of Allied soldiers gathered throughout southern England, preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in military history. Every soldier understood the importance of the coming operation. Failure could prolong the war indefinitely. Successes could begin the liberation of Western Europe. The Big Red One received one of the hardest assignments, Omaha Beach. German defenses overlooking the beach represented years of preparation. Concrete bunkers housed machine guns capable of sweeping entire landing zones. Artillery batteries targeted approaching ships. Minefields covered likely exits. Barbed wire blocked movement inland. Many German officers believed Omaha Beach impossible to capture. The Atlantic Wall appeared overwhelming. Before dawn on June 6, 1944, soldiers climbed into landing craft pitching violently in rough seas. Some became seasick. Others quietly checked photographs of loved ones. Many simply waited. Naval bombardment thundered across the horizon as hundreds of ships opened fire. Then the landing craft approached shore. German machine guns immediately erupted. Water exploded around the advancing boats. Landing ramps dropped. Cows followed. Men carrying 80 pounds of equipment plunged into deep water under continuous fire. Some never reached shore. Others struggled through surf while bullets struck around them. Entire squads disappeared within seconds. Officers became casualties before issuing their first commands. The carefully rehearsed invasion plan dissolved almost instantly beneath overwhelming resistance, yet small groups of soldiers continued moving. That became the defining characteristic of Omaha Beach, not perfect coordination, not flawless planning, but individual determination. The Big Red One fought yard by yard across sand stained by smoke, seawater, and shattered equipment. Their engineers blasted gaps through obstacles, while infantry crawled forward using shell craters as cover. Machine gun nests dominating the beach gradually fell silent one after another. Often they were attacked from unexpected directions by small groups acting independently after losing contact with higher headquarters. German defenders later admitted surprise at how quickly isolated American soldiers reorganized. One German machine gunner recalled believing the invasion had failed during the first hour. Then he noticed something disturbing. Every American he believed killed seemed replaced by another advancing from somewhere else. The attack stopped. By afternoon, the Big Red One had forced openings through the cliffs overlooking Omaha Beach. Once those exits fell, additional forces poured inland. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. German commanders reviewing the battle later struggled to explain why heavily fortified defenses failed. Several concluded that American persistence exceeded expectations. One after-action report stated that defensive positions inflicted enormous casualties, yet failed to halt the assault because attackers refused to abandon objectives despite catastrophic losses. The campaign continued through Normandy's dense hedgerows. Unlike open deserts, Normandy forced combat into enclosed fields separated by thick earth embankments covered with vegetation. Vividison sometimes extended only a few meters. Every hedge concealed possible ambushes. German defenders exploited the terrain masterfully. Machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons transformed each field into another battlefield. Progress slowed dramatically. Dead. The Big Red One adapted once more. Engineers welded steel prongs onto Sherman tanks, allowing them to break through hedgerows rather than climb over them. Infantry coordinated closely with armor. Dead. Artillery observers moved dangerously close to enemy positions, directing accurate fire. Small unit leadership again proved decisive. German reports increasingly described American attacks as relentless rather than sophisticated. Dead. One officer observed that the Americans possessed extraordinary willingness to continue advancing regardless of immediate losses. Another admitted that every successful defense merely delayed another assault. Setting. The psychological pressure intensified. German soldiers realized victories remained temporary. Sooner or later the Big Red One returned. Night offered little relief. Patrols crossed no man's land, gathering intelligence, capturing prisoners, and identifying defensive weaknesses. German sentries learned to remain constantly alert. Sleep became difficult, fatigue accumulated, morale slowly eroded. One captured German veteran later remarked that facing experienced and American divisions meant fighting two enemies simultaneously, the soldiers themselves and exhaustion. The Big Red One advanced steadily across France after the breakout from Normandy. Villages celebrated liberation. French civilians greeted exhausted infantry with flowers, food, and cheers. Yet the soldiers rarely paused long. The orders always pointed east, toward Germany. Every kilometer brought stronger resistance. Every river represented another defensive line. German commanders increasingly relied upon delaying actions, hoping to slow Allied momentum. And the Big Red One repeatedly forced crossings under fire. Bridges destroyed by retreating Germans required rapid reconstruction. Engineers worked while artillery shells exploded around them. Infantry established bridgeheads before armor crossed. Again and again operations succeeded because individual initiative compensated for confusion. Test. One German officer later admitted frustration that destroying bridges rarely delayed the Americans as long as expected. They always seemed to find another way. That simple observation summarized months of campaigning. And obstacles delayed them. They did not stop them. By autumn 1944, the division approached Germany itself. The fighting became even more desperate. German soldiers defended their homeland with renewed determination. Cities transformed into fortresses, forests concealed artillery, roads disappeared beneath craters, weather deteriorated, rain turned fields into mud, cold penetrated uniforms. Supplies struggled to reach frontline units. Still, the advance continued. German intelligence officers reviewing battlefield reports repeatedly identified the familiar red numeral. Wherever it appeared, resistance soon faced increasing pressure. Dead. One commander reportedly instructed subordinate officers to strengthen sectors opposite the Big Red One because previous encounters demonstrated their tendency to attack aggressively regardless of weather. Respect had replaced underestimation. The Germans no longer dismissed American infantry. They recognized experienced professionals. One captured Wehrmacht captain summarized his experience during interrogation. When the 1st Division attacked, you understood two things. First, they would keep coming. Second, if you stopped one company, another would appear. That realization defined the reputation earned by the Big Red One. It was not invincibility. It was persistence. The Germans had fought brave enemies before. The Soviets at Stalingrad, the British in North Africa. Yet, many veterans noted something distinctive about experienced American divisions. Then, they combined overwhelming logistical support with soldiers increasingly confident in their battlefield abilities. Every successful campaign strengthened that confidence. Every victory reinforced expectations of eventual success. German commanders understood the danger. An enemy convinced of victory often became even harder to defeat than one merely following orders. The Big Red One embodied that confidence. By late 1944, German soldiers no longer asked whether the division would attack. The first true test came during the fighting around the German frontier, where the ancient fortifications of the Siegfried Line stretched across forests, rivers, and concrete strongpoints that had been designed to bleed any invading army white. German commanders believed those defenses would finally stop the relentless American advance. They had faith in reinforced bunkers, overlapping machine gun fire, hidden artillery, and minefields laid with mathematical precision. Then the 1st Infantry Division arrived. The first assaults were costly. Machine gun fire swept entire fields. Mortar rounds exploded among advancing riflemen. The engineers crawled forward under fire to clear paths through mines while infantry hugged the frozen ground, waiting for the slightest opportunity to move another few yards. German observers watched through binoculars as American attacks stalled. Then they expected the same pattern they had seen so many times before. Pause, withdrawal, reorganization. Instead, something different happened. Whenever one platoon was forced back, another quietly appeared from another direction. Whenever a machine gun nest believed it had survived the assault, American artillery corrected its aim with frightening speed. Whenever German defenders believed they had broken the attack, fresh infantry emerged through smoke and shellfire. The pressure never stopped. One Wehrmacht artillery officer later described it in his diary. The Americans did not attack like waves. They attacked like water. You could delay them. You could wound them. But somehow they always found another path. That observation spread among German frontline units because it perfectly described the Big Red One. The division rarely relied on dramatic breakthroughs. It relied on relentless pressure. Then, every hour, the defenders remained under attack, reduced their ammunition, reduced their strength, reduced their confidence. Eventually, the line collapsed not because one assault succeeded, but because hundreds of smaller actions slowly made resistance impossible. Veterans later remembered that this constant pressure was more exhausting than the violence itself. There was never time to recover, never time to sleep properly, never time to reorganize. Every sound in the darkness could signal another American patrol. Every movement in the trees might be another squad probing for weakness. The psychological effect became devastating. Then, captured German documents repeatedly mentioned exhaustion before they mentioned casualties. One intelligence report concluded that American infantry had developed an operational rhythm that prevented defenders from regaining initiative. That rhythm became the division's greatest weapon. Then came the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944, Hitler launched his final major offensive in the West. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, more than 200 dead German soldiers. The objective was simple: Saturn the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, force a negotiated peace. The surprise was almost complete. American lines bent under enormous pressure. Entire sectors disappeared beneath snow, smoke, and confusion. The 1st Infantry Division was thrown back into the fight. Veterans who had already survived North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy once again found themselves facing experienced German formations determined to reverse the course of the war. The weather favored Germany. Heavy clouds grounded Allied aircraft. Snow buried roads. Fuel froze. Visibility collapsed. Exactly the conditions German planners had hoped for, yet once again they encountered the same problem. The Big Red One refused to panic. Small groups continued fighting even after communications failed. Then, companies held crossroads long after neighboring units had withdrawn. Officers disappeared. Sergeants assumed command. Sergeants fell. Corporals continued leading. The chain never truly broke. Then, a German major later admitted during interrogation that American junior leaders created enormous uncertainty because eliminating officers no longer guaranteed confusion. Responsibility simply passed to someone else. Again and again, the division continued advancing. The division continued defending. The division continued adapting. That adaptability confused German planners. Traditional doctrine expected organized formations. They found countless small groups making independent decisions while somehow contributing to the same larger objective. One captured German operations officer summarized it bluntly: "They fought without waiting." That single sentence explained why American momentum proved so difficult to stop. Many German units still depended heavily on detailed centralized orders. American infantry increasingly depended upon initiative. Every squad leader understood the mission. Even if communications disappeared, the objective remained clear: move forward, support neighboring units, dusty resistance, keep pressure on the enemy. German officers repeatedly remarked that American soldiers seemed unusually willing to improvise. Bridge, find another crossing, gabled tank, support it with infantry, machine gun lost, borrow another, radio destroyed, and runners. Everything became a temporary obstacle rather than a permanent failure. That mentality proved extraordinarily dangerous. During the advance into Germany itself, towns became miniature fortresses. Every street could become an ambush. Every cellar could conceal machine guns. Every church tower could hide observers directing artillery fire. Urban combat punished both sides equally. Yet, German reports continued describing the same disturbing characteristic. American infantry refused to become predictable. Instead of attacking only along roads, they entered through gardens. Instead of advancing directly down streets, they blasted holes through buildings. Instead of fighting one house at a time, they bypassed strongpoints and isolated defenders. Each adaptation forced German commanders to rewrite plans already collapsing under battlefield pressure. By early 1945, many experienced German officers privately admitted that victory was no longer possible. The remaining objective became survival. Still, they noticed one American formation appearing again and again at decisive points: the Big Red One. The division had become more than another infantry unit. It had become a symbol. Its arrival usually meant major offensive operations were about to begin. Then its reputation often reached German positions before the soldiers themselves. One captured lieutenant confessed that hearing the 1st Infantry Division had entered his sector immediately lowered morale among his men. They always came back, no matter how many times you stopped them. That reputation carried into the crossing of the Rhine. German planners expected enormous casualties. Instead, Allied coordination overwhelmed remaining defenses. The Big Red One crossed into the heart of Germany as organized resistance steadily collapsed. Town after town surrendered, others fought briefly before falling. Some SS formations resisted fanatically. Most regular Wehrmacht units increasingly understood the war had been lost. Then came something few soldiers ever forgot: the liberation of concentration camps. Hardened veterans who had survived years of combat suddenly found themselves standing before evidence of crimes beyond imagination. Many later wrote that those moments affected them more deeply than any battle. The combat had prepared them for death. It had not prepared them for systematic cruelty. Several veterans later admitted they never truly recovered from what they witnessed inside those camps. The war finally ended in May 1945. Then, Germany surrendered. The guns fell silent. For the men of the Big Red One, the numbers were staggering. They had landed in North Africa, invaded Sicily, stormed Omaha Beach, broken through France, fought the Battle of the Bulge, entered Germany itself. Few divisions anywhere had fought longer or harder. Their casualty lists stretched across nearly every campaign in the European theater. Yet their legacy extended beyond medals and battle honors. German officers writing after the war rarely focused on American equipment when describing the 1st Infantry Division. Instead, they returned to the same themes: Adaptability, adaptability, pressure. One former Wehrmacht colonel summarized it years later. The Americans possessed many advantages, but the greatest was not industrial. It was human. The soldier standing before you almost always believed tomorrow belonged to him. That belief made him extraordinarily difficult to defeat. Perhaps that is why the Big Red One earned such respect from its enemies, not because it never suffered. It suffered constantly, not because it never failed. It failed often. Not because it was invincible. No army is. It earned respect because every setback became another reason to continue. German soldiers expected exhaustion to end resistance. Instead, they found determination. They expected casualties to break morale. Instead, they found replacement leaders already stepping forward. They expected fear to stop attacks. Instead, they found attacks continuing through fear. That is why so many German battlefield accounts describe the same emotion: not hatred, not even anger. Respect, professional respect earned under the harshest conditions imaginable. When the war ended, the Big Red One had become one of the most decorated divisions in American military history. Its story was not simply one of victories. It was the story of ordinary men who crossed continents, survived impossible battles, and convinced even their enemies that some formations possessed something beyond training or equipment. The German soldiers who faced them searched for different explanations: superior logistics, better artillery, greater air power. All were true. But again and again, buried inside captured reports and private diaries, appeared another conclusion: the Americans simply would not stop. For the men who fought against the Big Red One, that became the division's defining characteristic. Not brilliance, not perfection, endurance. And in war, endurance is often the quality that decides history.